Hello, World History class. It is, Wednesday, May 6th, and we're starting our unit on the Cold War. Yesterday you read a chapter and watched videos, and today you're taking a quiz, and so I'm going to lead you through this quiz today if you need the extra support. And so here we go. I've got the chapter, which looks like this, from page 965 through 970 is where I ask questions, okay? And let's get into it. So, at the Alta Conference during World War II, what three leaders met to discuss the post-war world? And so, during World War II, there were several conferences. There was one called Yalta, there was one called Potsdam, and there was one called Tehran. And at the Yalta Conference, the leaders who were there, this was during the war, and so some of these leaders who were there here weren't around at the end of the war. So Joseph Stalin was one of them, because Stalin lives until 1953. 1953. And Winston Churchill was also there, and Franklin Roosevelt was also there. And you can see this picture of them. And Roosevelt was about to die. He would die later that year. You can see just how worn he looks in this photograph. Stalin's no spring chicken himself. Neither is Churchill, but the reason Churchill wasn't there at the end of the war is because he was voted out of power. Another guy, Clement Attlee, came in. But these were the big three who were making these decisions about the world afterward, before the war was even won. And the big rivalries were between the USSR and the USA. Okay, so that's question one. What did the Allies agree to do to Germany once the war was over? And so a lot of their thinking about was what happened to start World War II. And they knew that the Treaty of Versailles from World War I was a huge mistake, that the humiliation and punishment of Germany. And so they did not want to recreate the Treaty of Versailles. But at the same time, they didn't want to have Germany have restored borders and free elections. They wanted to make sure that Germany would not be the aggressor in another war. So they needed to have some kind of a way to limit Germany's power. And so what they decided to do, and we'll see later that the USSR had different goals for Germany than the USA did. And so they compromised and decided to divide Germany into different zones of occupation and also compensate the Soviet Union for losses of life and property. Remember, they lost 20 million people in the war. Billions of dollars in damage. And this is when Germany split down the middle into East Germany, which is controlled by the Soviet Union in the east, and then West Germany, which is under the protection or control of the United States in the west. And so Germany just gets cut up, partitioned in half. What's the purpose of the United Nations? Well, again, at the end of World War II, they want to avoid the problems that led to war. And so the United Nations is a group of every country in the world is invited. And the buildings in New York City where they meet. And they've been there since the end of World War II. And the purpose is to try to prevent wars from happening. And also to prevent larger nations from ganging up on weaker nations. And so this is the purpose of the UN. It's incredibly important. It's one of a world organization that's dedicated to world peace. And there's lots of squabbling there. There's lots of argument, but that's what if we didn't have that place, then there would be, instead of argument, there'd be a lot more bullets being fired instead. And so while it's sometimes criticized for being ineffectual or it's incredibly important to have representatives from every single government there. Even North Korea, even Cuba, people who are or countries that are our enemies, or Syria or Iraq, they all have representatives there, a place to try to overcome differences. There are 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council makes decisions about where the UN should intervene. So there have been wars that the UN has led. The Korean War is one of them. The first war in Iraq in 1989, the UN led in order to, one was to stop North Korean aggression, the other one was to stop Iraqi aggression into Kuwait. And so there are 5 members who are permanently on this Security Council of 11 countries that have the power to either declare war. That's their big power. And so those 5 permanent members are the USA. So the ones I put up here are all ones who are on the Security Council right now, but some of them, their terms expire and they have to go, but there's some who are permanent. The USA is a permanent member. USSR, now it's Russia, is a permanent member. China is a permanent member. Britain is a permanent member, and France is a permanent member. Even though Germany is a very powerful and wealthy country now, it is because it started World War II, they were not put on the UN Security Council. So the permanent members are France, Britain, China, USSR, and USA. All right, what power do the permanent members of the Security Council have? Their power is the right to veto. So they can veto a resolution. Remember, that's like the president's or the executive's power to veto legislation, to say, no, you can't do that. And so if their UN is voting to go to war, any of those countries have the ability to veto, to say, no, we are going to not allow it. This makes sure that if there are resolutions by the United Nations, that they have the support of the most powerful countries in the world. And so that veto power is a big one. And in the Korean War, Russia decided not to, or the USSR decided not to vote. So instead of using its veto power or voting for it, they decided not to vote at all. And that's why the UN went to war in Korea. Okay, what were the aims or goals? Aims is just another word for goal. Think about it as like you're aiming at a target. That's your aim, your goal. In Europe or the United States after World War II. So pick 3. Did the United States want to encourage communism? No. In fact, they wanted to stop the spread of communism. Let's see. Gain access to raw materials and markets to fuel booming industries? Yes, this is one of the goals of the United States. Remember, the United States is an imperialist nation, and they wanted access to raw materials and markets, as imperialist nations do. They wanted the access to Europe's raw material and markets, all those Europeans to buy our products. So this was one of the goals. Rebuild European governments to promote stability and create new markets for U.S. goods. Yes, we wanted to rebuild European governments, especially ones that were going to be loyal to us, to promote stability. We want loyalty. We also want stability. We don't want another war, because war causes lots of instability and loss of life and money. Encourage democracy in other countries to help prevent the rise of communist governments. Yes, this was it. Although sometimes we encourage democracy through assassinations, but you can see the Cold War is a time when our values are going to be pushed to the limits. When we're fighting against communism, we end up, it's like, is it good to almost to cheat or to be immoral when you're trying to fight a battle that you think is moral? Do the ends justify the means? Rebuild war-ravaged economy using Eastern Europe's industrial equipment and raw materials? No. Keep Germany divided to prevent it from waging war again? No. Control Eastern Europe to protect Soviet borders? No. So I think I gave you 3. Yeah, 1, 2, and 3. All right, on the other hand, what were the goals of the Soviet Union? 4 of them, and they're the 4 that we didn't pick from the last one. So I'll have you decide what that is. I think the most important idea is, remember that the Soviet Union was invaded by Germany. 20 million people died. It was a lot more destroyed than the United States was. And so they wanted to make sure Germany was divided to prevent it from ever waging war again. And it goes into this this next question. Why did Stalin want to dominate Eastern Europe after World War II? Well, he wanted this. He wanted to create a buffer of nations to protect him from foreign invasion. And so what does this mean? Let's see. Let's say you've got Germany here, okay? You've got Czechoslovakia there. You've got Poland here. You've got Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania here. You've got USSR here. Okay. You've got, let's see, This is basically it. Hungary and Austria and Romania and Bulgaria. There's the Black Sea. Then you've got Turkey. And let's say here's Greece. And let's put Yugoslavia here. Yugoslavia, the Union of Slavs. My map isn't connecting very well. That's Switzerland, France, Spain, Italy. Okay, we've got Norway, Sweden, Finland up here. You've got Britain, the island up here. These link together. Sorry, it's a little messy. Here we go. Okay. Basically, Germany after World War II gets split in half. And then you get West Germany and you get East Germany. And the Soviets, another word for the Russians or the USSR, they want to control all of this territory right there. Why? Because if they get attacked again, they serve as a buffer, meaning they'll get hit first before the USSR gets hit. And so they want to make sure that they establish governments that they can control and that and that will protect them if they're attacked again by Germany. And they're also splitting Germany and making East Germany loyal to it. And so they're going to remake all these countries in their own image. Remember open tip CCC from totalitarianism? It's going to be one party system, just Communist Party, with lots of propaganda, economic control by the state and a command economy, extreme nationalism, terror, indoctrination, secret police, the cult of personality, and censorship in all of these different places. The USSR is going to make them loyal and remake them in their own image. And on this side is basically a communist side. And on this side is the part of Europe that's loyal to the United States over here. And so that's sort of how the Cold War breaks down. I apologize for my for my map, but these are basically, this is the buffer. These different countries controlled by the USSR are going to protect it from an earlier invasion. And so how did the Iron Curtain divide Europe? I used to think there was literally an iron wall that went all the way through Europe. There was not an iron wall that went all the way through Europe. It was a metaphor. It was a symbolism in a speech by Churchill that he gave in Fulton, Missouri, shortly after World War II, where he said an iron curtain has descended over the old great capitals of Europe. And so it's just meant that there was a Soviet sphere of influence. Think of it as like imperialism. The Soviets controlled all these countries. And on one side was communism, on the other side was democracy and capitalism. And so that's what the Iron Curtain meant. And it basically goes all the way down like that. That's the Iron Curtain. Actually, let me get Austria on this side. Sorry, Austria. Austria is free from communism. Yugoslavia is a weird place because even though they were communist, they were ruled by a guy named Tito, Joseph Tito, and he was a dictator for a long time, but he was not loyal to Stalin. So Yugoslavia, I'm putting like a little an asterisk next to, because even though they're communist, they're not going to be loyal to the USSR or controlled the way the USSR wants to control them. Okay, so Iron Curtain into a democratic West and a communist East, right? Democracy in USA controls this side, USSR controls this side, the East, right? This is, there's our north, east, south, west, south. USA controls this side. We had a sphere of influence or hegemony, a shadowing, a indirect control over that side. USSR has a pretty direct control over this side. Yugoslavia is sort of the one outlier that's communist but not directly controlled by the USSR. All right, this policy of containment, this really became United States policy over the next 40 years to contain communism. It's like when you play against LeBron or Michael Jordan. You want them, you know they're going to score a bunch of points. You just hope to contain them, that they don't break out of their normal huge scoring. And so the idea here was that for the United States, we wanted to contain communism where it was. And where it was basically along this pencil line, okay, in this area. But the USSR tried to expand its influence in communism into Turkey here and also into Greece. And so President Truman, the same guy who dropped the atom bomb, right, he's also going to start this containment policy, meaning we're not going to attack the USSR and these communist states, but we're going to stop them from spreading influence outside. And so the United States gave $400 million shortly after World War II to prop up the governments of Turkey and of Greece from becoming communist. How do they do that? Well, all that money buys weapons, it buys, it bribes people, and it allowed Greece and Turkey to remain democratic and under U.S. influence instead of under Soviet influence. So under the Truman Doctrine and containment, Turkey and Greece are supported by the United States. Later, this policy of containment is it's the reason we fought the Vietnam War and the Korean War and supported assassinations and governments in Chile and El Salvador. But in the beginning of the Cold War, it was aid for Greece and Turkey. This idea is going to spread, and containment is really what U.S. foreign policy was after World War II until 1990. And the name of the U.S. plan that gave food, machinery, materials, and close to $13 billion to rebuild Europe following World War II. So rather than punish and humiliate and force Germany to pay us money, our idea was to rebuild Europe. How can we make a world that's safe? By strengthening the economies and strengthening the political systems of these of war-torn Europe. And so we gave Europe $13 billion, and it's a long-term investment. Also, if you loan someone money, they're going to be more loyal to you too. And so, for example, let's say someone says, here, I'll give you a free ride to college and I'll give you a job out of college, but I might call you for help later. And then one day you get a call from that person who loaned you the money and says, hey, I'd like you to do something for me. I want you to kill somebody for me. And you'd be like, what? Really? Yeah, it's a favor for me. You're like, okay. What we end up doing is say, hey, can we put some nuclear missiles in your country? Remember all that help we gave you before? Okay, all right, sure. And so the Marshall Plan is a way to rebuild Europe and prevent war, but it's also a way to try to get allies on the United States side who are going to be loyal to them in their competition and fight between the USA and USSR. And so even though we offered money to all of these communist countries as well, they rejected it. The only communist country that accepted US money was Yugoslavia. The USSR, so this money, this plan, this was the Marshall Plan, and that's $13 billion in 1947 dollars, so even more today, to massively rebuild Europe as an investment. And the USSR, their opposing plan was called Comecon, which is not the comic convention, but communist economies. They gave money to support communist countries in here. Okay, so the name of the US plan was the Marshall Plan. The one communist country that chose to receive Marshall Plan aid, that was Yugoslavia with Tito. Okay, based on the chart below, which nations did the United States offer aid to who had just been enemies during World War II? So this is also an amazing thing. We're rebuilding countries instead of humiliating, instead of destroying and taking advantage of countries who we had just beaten. Our idea was to build them back up. And by building them back up, we'd be able to create a lasting peace. And we learned this lesson the hard way, right? After the Treaty of Versailles. And so who were countries that we fought against? Who were in the Axis powers? Well, we had Italy was in the Axis powers and Germany. So you pick those. And also Austria was annexed or part of Nazi Germany. So the three nations here in Marshall Plan 8 are Italy, West Germany, and Austria. Right here, of course, we're looking at Europe. We also gave billions of dollars to rebuild Japan with the same idea. They're not on this list. But you check off Italy. Remember with Mussolini, after he's out, we say, hey, it was Mussolini's fault and the fascists. We're going to rebuild Italy. We're going to rebuild Austria, and we're going to rebuild the western part of Germany that's under the U.S. control. All right. After the Soviets cut off water, railroad, and highway traffic to West Berlin, how did the Americans, British, and French respond? Okay, this always used to confuse me. And so the city of Berlin, so there's West Germany, there's East Germany, right? It's split down the middle. This is controlled by the USA, and this is controlled by the USSR. Well, the city of Berlin is deep in East Germany right there, okay? And so this side was controlled by the USSR, and this side was controlled by the USA. But look, it's deep inside East German territory. And so the way that they used to get food and supplies was through railroads that would go from the west to the east. So the Soviets cut off the railroad, they cut off roads, and they cut off the water supply to the city of West Berlin inside East Germany. And so how does the USA, they wanted to destroy the city and conquer the whole thing. After the war, though, the USA and Britain and France had control of this sector of the city. And so what the USA, Britain, and France did was for over a year, they flew in supplies. They airlifted. This was called the Berlin Airlift. And they, something like every 3 minutes, a new plane would land or they'd drop supplies, food and machinery and gasoline and clothes to keep them supplied so that they could survive through the siege. And eventually the Soviets lifted the blockade and they were able to go back to normal again. But after a year of this, why would the Soviets not directly shoot down any of the planes? Well, that could lead to war. And so they decided not to do that. After all, the United States had atomic weapons by that point, as well as the USSR. They didn't want to start a nuclear war. But this is why during the rest of the Cold War, there's this little oasis of USA and Western countries and allies in the middle of communist East Germany. And this became a flashpoint, a potential place where one little conflict could spark a worldwide European, and then if my map went bigger to the world, would spark a worldwide conflict. And the Berlin Airlift was the first test of going to the edge and backing down. The Soviets backed down at the very end. That going to the edge idea is called brinksmanship, going to the brink or going right to the edge of war. Okay, let's see. So how did they respond? Here it is. They flew in supplies for over a year to keep the city from falling to the communists. Why was the conflict between the USA and the USSR known as the Cold War? It's because there was never a direct conflict between the USA and USSR. If there had been, it would have been nuclear war between two countries that would have caused the destruction of humanity, literally an extinction event. It's something that still hangs over us, which is why we don't want to get into a hot war with China or a hot war with Russia, because we're both armed with thousands of nuclear weapons that could destroy the world, literally wipe out humanity. And so there's never a hot war, but there were other less direct means of confrontation, like proxy wars, where we fought their allies or they fought our allies, and spying and stuff like that, but never a war between the two countries. Okay, the military alliance that we are in with other European nations and Canada to stop Soviet aggression is called NATO. And it's still an alliance that we're a part of today. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, it's the USA and Canada and Britain and France, and let's see, in Italy, and West Germany was involved. Some countries remained out of NATO, and gradually NATO's gotten bigger and bigger through the years. Currently, Poland is a NATO country, but back then it was just these countries in a military alliance. And talk about a scary time. What does it mean if you're in a military alliance? Think back to World War I and the Entente and the Triple Alliance. If just one country's attacked, that means that all the countries have to fight. And so the USA puts together this alliance. And so why does the USSR not want to attack West Germany? Because they know if they do, all the other countries are going to come fighting again. And so this is called NATO. However, the Soviets decided after NATO was created that they would create their own military alliance, and that's known as the Warsaw Pact. And the Warsaw Pact countries, Warsaw is a city in Poland. It involved Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany. They were all part of the Warsaw Pact. So later there's going to be revolution in Hungary and revolution in Czechoslovakia, and you're going to see people being attacked by Soviet tanks, but the US does not intervene because they know if they do, it could spark a worldwide war. Oh, and by the way, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have been gobbled up, and they were part of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. They weren't independent anymore. Okay. We're getting there. China and India, they were non-aligned. They decided not to be involved. In 1953, what more destructive weapon did the USA and USSR possess? The H-bomb, the hydrogen bomb. So we saw how bad the atom bomb was. Well, looking at here, the hydrogen or H-bomb was thousands of times more powerful than the A-bomb. So remember, the A-bomb killed 200,000 people with just one bomb. The current hydrogen bomb, or the hydrogen bombs that they developed only about 6 years afterward, were thousands of times more powerful. And this came from fusion or joining together of atoms rather than the splitting of atoms. That's known as fission. And so these fusion bombs are much more powerful. Google up something called the Tsar Bomba, the largest hydrogen bomb ever attempted. It is frighteningly enormous. There's video footage of it from I think it's 1963, around that era. Okay, effects of the policy of brinksmanship, this idea of going to the edge. The United States, they would retaliate instantly with overwhelming force, according to our Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. This is, again, part of this containment policy. If the USSR tried to expand anywhere or start war in any of the member states around, also Greece and Turkey become members of NATO, and they're still members of NATO today. One of the reasons that we haven't acknowledged the Armenian genocide is because Turkey was our strong ally against the Soviets during the Cold War, and we didn't want to embarrass them. And they're our ally because this is where we have military bases to fight against Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan. We go in through Turkey, and so we don't want to make them upset. So this is this whole enemy of my enemy is my friend thing. We've made friends or allies with some pretty unsavory states in order to fight against greater enemies. And so we've propped up some pretty bad governments around the world, and we'll be learning about that in this unit. And so what's a result of brinksmanship? It is not détente. This is a lessening of tensions. Brinksmanship makes things more tense. This is one, a nuclear arms race that built up weapons. American production of more nuclear weapons. Yes, these two. A larger, stronger U.S. Air Force. Yes, this is the case. Later, we build missiles that could reach any target in the world, called intercontinental ballistic missiles. But at the time, we built a large Air Force that was constantly in the air and ready to drop an atom bomb on the Soviet Union. We had those bases all over the world, including Alaska, which is close to the USSR, and also in Turkey. Also, this is another one, brinksmanship, huge investments in the education systems of the USA and USSR in science and math. Why? Because we wanted to develop new technology to be superior to the other and to give us an advantage. We also created the space program, which one was for, and we'll look at the space program tomorrow and the next day. But a lot of it is an outgrowth of finding new technology, not just for weapons, but for prestige. And the weapons that came out of the space program included computers and included intercontinental missiles. There's greater spycraft and espionage, right? We were paying spies and putting spies in the USSR, and they had spies in the USA. So all of these are checked off. This greater trust between the people of the USA and USSR, no, that is not the case. When I grew up during the Cold War, people thought of Russians as evil or bad people, rather than their leaders. Okay, these last two questions. This photograph is taken in 1948 over the city of Berlin. What is the airplane most likely dropping? Well, this is during the Berlin airlift, and so they'd be dropping food. Okay, this next one is a cartoon from 1949. And see this, Uncle Sam with a bunch of money, and it says, I love this guy, but sometimes I think he's too good. The US taxpayer, her pockets are empty. And this says he's taking our money to other parts of the world. And so this is the Marshall Plan diverts funds that should be spent in the United States rather than abroad. This is the idea. That why are we spending all this money abroad rather than at home? Well, the idea was we're going to be making more money abroad if we have all these allies. It's also to stop the Soviet Union and rebuild Europe so that we don't have to have another costly war. So this is likely what the cartoonist believed, this last one. Okay, finally, this is what nation made this cartoon and what's the purpose of it? So if you look at this, what nation most likely made it? We'll look at the teeth of this barking dog. It says NATO. Does this look like a nice dog? No. So it's likely from who did not like NATO, who was against NATO. NATO, remember, is the military alliance of the United States and Western European nations. And this would be, it's East Germany, but it's controlled by the Soviets. And so is this an American cartoon? No, it's not, because America's NATO, and this is making NATO look like a bad guy. It's not a British cartoon. Is it a Soviet cartoon demonizing NATO as a threat to peace and stability? Or is it an East German cartoon welcoming NATO's military alliance to protect it from Soviet domination? It's this, a Soviet cartoon demonizing NATO. So remember, we learned about propaganda back in World War I. These political cartoons are propaganda also in the newspapers and Soviet newspapers, which we remember also has extreme censorship. Okay, that's it. Thanks for listening, and I hope this helped, and good luck, and I miss you guys, and I'm thinking of you often. All right, bye-bye.